The People's Republic of China, PRC, is engaged in a persistent, multifaceted effort to secure international acceptance of its version of the One China principle. This principle asserts that Taiwan is part of a single China of which the PRC is the sole legitimate government, and that Taiwan has no independent international legal status. An increasingly prominent element in the PRC's strategy relies on a claim about international law, that UNGA Resolution 2758, which gave the PRC the Chinese seat at the UN, previously occupied by the Republic of China, ROC, and UN interpretations of the resolution, established the PRC's position on Taiwan as a settled matter of international law, binding on all states. Behind this assertion lies a set of flawed assumptions and arguments, Beijing's sustained pressure and influence on UN entities and officials, and a pattern of acquiescence, misinterpretation, or misunderstanding by those entities and officials. The PRC's efforts have been more sustained and effective than the pushback they have faced, primarily from Taiwan's diplomatic partners and occasionally from the United States. Beijing's agenda has also benefited from its choice of a forum that advantages its cause. The UN system has been a favorable arena for the PRC for reasons that include its one-state, one-vote structure, the limited salience of the Taiwan issue for most member states, and the influence that the PRC and its nationals wield in the UN and related international institutions. The stakes are high. If Beijing wins acceptance of its position in the international community, Taiwan's security and the status quo in the Taiwan Strait are at increased risk. The PRC could more credibly claim, legally and politically, that the use of force or threats of force or other highly coercive measures to achieve unification of Taiwan would be lawful. The PRC could also more plausibly argue that measures by the United States or other states to prevent or deter such an outcome would be unlawful violations of PRC sovereignty or interference in its internal affairs. More broadly, acceptance of the PRC's views on the legal meaning and impact of Resolution 2758 would weaken the UN's integrity and increase the challenges facing the rules-based international order. Title 1, China's International Law Claims and UN Actions and Statements. UNGA Resolution 2758, adopted on October 25, 1971, transferred the Chinese seat at the UN from the ROC that governed Taiwan and offshore islands to the PRC that governed the Chinese mainland. The PRC now asserts that the resolution, or its later interpretation, has embedded its version of a One China principle in international law. This position reached a new level of clarity and assertiveness, and took on a sharper legal dimension in the PRC's August 2022 White Paper on Taiwan, the Taiwan Question and China's Reunification in the New Era. UNGA Resolution 2758 settled once and for all the political, legal, and procedural issues of China's representation in the UN, and it covered the whole country, including Taiwan. Resolution 2758 is a political document encapsulating the One China principle whose legal authority leaves no room for doubt and has been acknowledged worldwide. The White Paper points to parallel measures by other major UN organs. The specialized agencies of the UN later adopted further resolutions. One of these is Resolution 25.1 adopted at the 25th World Health Assembly in May 1972. The White Paper also invokes a 2010 opinion from the OLA, the UN's principal legal advisory organ. It was clearly stated in the official legal opinions of the Office of Legal Affairs of the UN Secretariat that the United Nations considers Taiwan as a province of China with no separate status, and the authorities in Taipei are not considered to enjoy any form of government status. At the UN, the island is referred to as Taiwan, Province of China. Citing a 2010 OLA memorandum, the White Paper further claims that when the United States and others characterize Taiwan's status as undetermined or declare support for Taiwan's meaningful participation in the UN system, they are acting in violation of Resolution 2758 and international law and are treating the basic principles of international law with contempt. Most of these claims have been echoed, and, earlier, foreshadowed, in other official PRC sources, including state media and statements by senior foreign ministry officials. Although Beijing's claims are now framed in these sharpened terms, they are not new. A 2000 White Paper, for example, declared that the long period of non-unification had not imbued Taiwan with status and rights in international law, nor could it change the legal status as a part of China, under both domestic and international law. A 2002 letter from the Permanent Mission of the PRC to the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, asserted that Resolution 2758 remains legally binding on member states of the UN. Aspects of the PRC's position on the implications of Resolution 2758 have taken apparent hold with some UN entities and officials. This has been most evident in two areas: requirements that references to Taiwan use the nomenclature Taiwan, Province of China, and statements that Taiwan is an integral part or part of China, sometimes expressed as being so for all intents and purposes or for all purposes. UN organs and officials often, but not always, assert that such pronouncements are required by Resolution 2758 itself or by binding legal opinions from within the UN, primarily ones that interpret Resolution 2758. The PRC has also made gains on a third, related front, misconstruing UN statements concerning recognition of the PRC as the government of China as an indication of Taiwan's lack of status, and doing so in the face of waning pushback from the UN. The PRC's claim that the resolution requires acceptance of Beijing's One China principle also has begun to appear in the official positions of non-UN international organizations and in one country's decision to switch diplomatic ties from Taipei to Beijing. For these statements and actions to establish the PRC's claims about international law and the issue of Taiwan's status, it would have to be the case that the sources cited say what Beijing claims they say, and that they were produced by institutions or processes that have the authority to make the requisite determinations concerning international law. The PRC's arguments, and UN statements and actions that align with the PRC's views, fail on one or both of these fronts. Title 2, What Resolution 2758 Does, and Does Not, Say, and Do. The PRC's position that UNGA Resolution 2758 adopts its One China principle, that there is only one China in the world and that Taiwan is a part of China, relies on a text that does not contain any such language. The resolution does not use the words Taiwan or Republic of China. Its only Taiwan-related statement is that the General Assembly has decided to expel forthwith the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek from the place which they unlawfully occupy in the United Nations and in all the organizations related to it. Concerning the PRC, Resolution 2758 declares that the restoration of the lawful rights of the People's Republic of China is essential for UN purposes, recognizes that the representatives of the government of the PRC are the only lawful representatives of China to the United Nations, and decides to restore all its rights to the PRC, and to recognize the representatives of its government as the only legitimate representative of China to the UN. The reference to the representatives of Chiang Kai-shek is fairly read as a somewhat oblique and, as a matter of international law, sloppy reference to representatives of the Republic of China, which was then and still is the government in Taiwan. The resolution's references to the PRC are inexact in a way that might seem to add unwarranted heft to Beijing's claims about the resolution's implications for Taiwan. In fact, there could be no question of restoring the PRC's prior rights at the UN because the PRC had not previously held any seat at the UN. None of this language, or the rest of the text of Resolution 2758, addresses, much less decides, the international legal question of Taiwan's status. In international law, the ROC and the PRC, in the sense in which those terms are used in the resolution, are not states. They are governments of a state, or states, that were, at the time of the resolution's adoption, rival claimants to be the government of the state of China. Official PRC statements accept this distinction. For example, the 2022 White Paper on Taiwan states that the new PRC government replaced the previous KMT Kuomintang regime in a situation where China, as a subject of international law, i.e., as a state, did not change. The resolution does give the PRC, for the first time, the exclusive role of representing the Chinese member state in the UN and related organizations, including specialized agencies such as the World Health Organization, WHO. The resolution thus had the effect of transferring the Chinese seat in the UN system from the ROC government and its representatives to the PRC government and its representatives. Resolution 2758 does not purport to do more concerning the question of Taiwan's status. Notably, when the resolution was adopted, the PRC did not understand it as having settled the legal question of Taiwan's status. In a conversation with U.S. National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger preceding the General Assembly vote, PRC Premier, and previously Foreign Minister, Zhou Enlai complained that the so-called Albanian resolution, which became Resolution 2758, fell short. The question is that in the other resolution, the Albanian resolution, it calls for the restoration of all lawful rights of China in the United Nations, including its seat in the UN. In that resolution it is not possible to put in a clause concerning the status of Taiwan, and, if it is passed, the status of Taiwan is not yet decided. Of course, countries who support the Albanian resolution haven't thought of this side of the question. What we are worried about is that if our legitimate rights in the United Nations are restored, while the status of Taiwan is left hanging in the air, we will have to consider this matter. The records of General Assembly debates that led to the adoption of Resolution 2758 reflect a variety of views among members about what the resolution meant, with more than 30 states specifically indicating that they saw the issue addressed by the resolution as merely a question of credentials, determining whether the representatives of the PRC or of Chiang Kai-shek should occupy the Chinese seat at the UN. Resolution 2758 did not purport to resolve the international legal question of Taiwan's status. On its own, it could not have done so. The General Assembly has the power, by majority vote, to determine who may represent a member state, including whether a purported representative has been accredited by a government in power in a member state. Resolution 2758 speaks to this question and, more broadly, to the question of what government can represent China, which was already a UN member. The General Assembly's authority to undertake in Resolution 2758 to decide the limited question of whether a particular government represents a particular member state, and thus may exercise the state's powers within the UN, appears to have been uncontroversial. In a decision that rejected a U.S. proposal, the General Assembly, prior to adopting Resolution 2758, declined even to call the issue addressed an important question, which would have required a supermajority vote. The General Assembly has a role in deciding whether to admit new UN members, but only when acting in conjunction with the Security Council. Resolution 2758 does not address an issue of membership, and the process for admitting a member was rightly assumed to be unnecessary and was not invoked. Taiwan and its diplomatic allies would later raise issues of membership or representation, particularly during the 1990s and 2000s. But when Resolution 2758 was adopted, a proposal for separate membership for Taiwan would have been rejected by Beijing and Taipei, which fully agreed at the time that there was one China that included Taiwan, although they disagreed about which entity, the ROC or the PRC, was the lawful government of that state. More fundamentally, the UN lacks independent power to decide the international legal status of Taiwan. The General Assembly is not an international legislature with general powers to make law for the international community or even for UN member states. The international legal system famously lacks such a plenary lawmaking institution, and its absence is a principal distinction between the international legal order and states' domestic legal orders. The General Assembly is even less an international court empowered to decide concrete legal questions, such as whether Taiwan is a part of the PRC. The powers of the OLA, the issuer of the memorandum on which Beijing relies in its 2022 white paper, and the legal officials and organs within the UN more generally, similarly lack powers to resolve the question of Taiwan's status as a matter of international law. The OLA is part of the UN Secretariat, is headed by the Legal Council/Under-Secretary General for Legal Affairs, and includes the Office of the Legal Council. These offices and officials serve as a source of legal advice for the Secretary General and other principal UN organs concerning interpretations of UN resolutions and a range of other UN matters. Their powers to make determinative legal decisions can, and do, sweep no more broadly than those of the Secretariat. In practice, their legal opinions and advice respond to specific requests from the Secretary General and other UN authorities. Analogous organs exist within UN specialized agencies, such as the WHO, and generally take positions in line with the OLA's determinations. Thus, the simplest form of the argument that Resolution 2758 settled the international legal status of Taiwan or adopted Beijing's One China principle as international law comes up short, both as a matter of substance, what it did not say about Taiwan's status, and process, the limits of UN powers to make international law or render international legal decisions. The uses and abuses of the resolution and related UN statements and actions addressing the international legal question of Taiwan's status and Beijing's One China principle, however, do not stop with the resolution itself. The PRC also relies on overreaching readings of UN interpretations and practices. But despite Beijing's claims and statements and actions by UN officials, which at times appear to align with the PRC's views, such glosses on Resolution 2758 do not support a conclusion that the resolution settled the question of Taiwan's status as a matter of international law. The next sections of this report address the complicated, half-century-long story of contested and contestable interpretations of Resolution 2758 and its implications for Taiwan's international legal status in terms of three principal, overlapping areas that, in Beijing's account or in UN behavior, align or superficially appear to align with the PRC's positions. The PRC's gains, or apparent gains, in these areas reflect its concerted efforts and considerable influence, and UN actors' acquiescence, misinterpretations, or misunderstandings of Resolution 2758, all of which have faced only limited pushback and rarely in an immediate, publicly visible form within and beyond the UN system. Title 3, References to Taiwan in UN Documents. How to refer to Taiwan in UN documents has been a focal point of the PRC's efforts to advance its argument that Resolution 2758 settled the issue of Taiwan's international legal status. A linchpin of this claim is an October 27, 2010, memorandum from the OLA, the only UN document other than Resolution 2758 that the PRC cites in connection with Taiwan's status in its 2022 white paper. The key passage for Beijing follows a quotation-heavy summary of the resolution. Since the adoption of that resolution, the United Nations considers Taiwan as a province of China with no separate status, and the Secretariat strictly abides by this decision in the exercise of its responsibilities. Thus, since the adoption of this resolution, the established practice of the United Nations has been to use the term Taiwan, province of China, when a reference to Taiwan is required in United Nations Secretariat documents. As with much else concerning the UN's positions on the implications of Resolution 2758, the OLA memorandum was issued in the shadow of the PRC's pressure and demands. It was also issued in response to representatives of State 2, China, having strongly objected to publication of a national report by State 1, Nauru, at the time a diplomatic partner of Taiwan, that includes a reference to the Republic of China, Taiwan, and having argued that its publication by the Secretariat is in violation of General Assembly Resolution 2758. Like the resolution, the OLA memorandum stops well short of Beijing's favored interpretation. It speaks only to the position and actions of the UN and the nomenclature to be used in UN Secretariat documents, not to Taiwan's legal status beyond the UN system. Its operative language addresses only the terminology to be used in documents produced by certain UN entities. The broader language concerning the UN's views of Taiwan's status is what lawyers would call dictum in a judicial opinion, a proposition that is not an essential basis for the decision reached and thus lacking precedential value. The memorandum also does not purport to excise all references to Taiwan that do not say Taiwan Province or Taiwan, Province of China from the UN system, or to claim that the use of other terms is unlawful in international affairs more generally. After stating the UN's established practice of using the term Taiwan, Province of China, the memorandum, which concerned the submission of a universal periodic review by a member state of its compliance with the principal UN human rights covenants, continues, however, the practice of the United Nations when circulating a document from a member state has been to reproduce the document as it has been received and not to alter the terminology employed. The United Nations cannot change its contents as this would be tantamount to interfering in the official/national position of a member state. The memorandum then rejects the proposal from the OHCHR, whose request prompted the memorandum, for the Secretariat to add a footnote to the national report. The footnote, which the OHCHR described as being still unsatisfactory to the PRC, would have said that, in accordance with United Nations terminology, reference to Taiwan in the present document should read Taiwan, Province of China. The OLA determined that the proposed footnote's indication that the reference to Taiwan in the report is incorrect was inappropriate because the submitting state could object to the footnote on the grounds that this is inconsistent with its national position and violated the Secretariat's obligation not to comment on terminology contained in the submission of a member state, which would be interfering in the intergovernmental process. The memorandum recommends the addition of a more restrained footnote. The document has been reproduced as received. The designations employed do not imply the expression of any opinion whatsoever on the part of the Secretariat concerning the legal status of any country, territory, or area, or of its authorities. This recommendation appears to have followed what was already well-established practice, including for handling requests by various diplomatic partners of Taiwan to consider placing Taiwan's representation or membership on the General Assembly's agenda. Such requests were circulated in the ordinary course of business, with references to Republic of China in Taiwan or other terminology not conforming to the Taiwan, Province of China template but with the addition of the type of disclaimer that the October 2010 OLA memorandum subsequently recommended. This practice dates back to the early 1990s, when, under President Lee Teng-hui, Taiwan began to seek greater engagement with the UN and pressure from the PRC against such terminology also dates to the same period. In response to the PRC permanent representative's strong objection to these requests, the Secretary-General and senior staff explained that the Secretariat was required to circulate such documents when submitted by member states, that the disclaimer had been added, and that the Secretariat had distanced itself from the content of the note. Also in the memorandum's background was an unusually strong intervention by the United States in response to the PRC's then mounting pressure in the UN about Taiwan's status. Washington had issued, but not publicly disclosed, in 2007 a non-paper in response to the UN's handling of an effort to put UN membership for Taiwan on the UN's agenda. The U.S. non-paper noted with concern Beijing's insistence that the UN and member states use nomenclature for Taiwan that suggests endorsement of China's sovereignty claims, expressed concern that some UN organizations had recently asserted that UN precedent required that Taiwan be referred to by names in keeping with such status, and warned that the United States will be obliged to dissociate itself from the Secretariat's position if that office insists on using such nomenclature. For Taiwan, the issues addressed in the memorandum are but one instance of a broader pattern. The WHO is another example, and one specifically noted in China's 2022 White Paper. Here, too, PRC demands concerning nomenclature and instances of acquiescence or drift by UN-affiliated officials have framed Beijing's favored positions as mandated by higher-level formal sources. Shortly after the General Assembly passed Resolution 2758, the World Health Assembly, WHA, adopted WHA Resolution 25.1, which closely tracked Resolution 2758. In 2005, the WHO's Secretariat entered into a Memorandum of Understanding, MOU, with the PRC, specifically, its Ministry of Health, concerning the World Health Body's interactions with Taiwan. A 2005 WHO document directing the MOU's implementation and invoking WHA Resolution 25.1 included directives on nomenclature, that invitations to Taiwanese experts could not be addressed to the Republic of China or Taiwan, such invitation should refer only to the name of the city from which Taiwanese experts came. The badges and the text in programs should refer to Taiwan, China, and any questions were to be directed to the WHO's Office of the Legal Counsel. A 2010 WHO document concerning the application of the international health regulations to the Taiwan province of China stated that the document's directives reflected an arrangement with respect to the Taiwan province of China that was communicated to the WHO Director General by the PRC's permanent mission in Geneva. This apparently Beijing-crafted arrangement referenced WHA Resolution 25.1, declared that references in WHO documents must use the terminology the Taiwan province of China, and must list information concerning Taiwan as falling under China and not separately as if they referred to a state. The document again directed that any questions or case of doubt be referred to the WHO Office of Legal Counsel. In the last several years, UN officials' practice has moved, without a corresponding change in the official position of the Secretariat's legal organs, beyond much prior UN practice and the circumspect position endorsed in the October 2010 OLA Memorandum. Despite the memorandum's cautions, UN organs and staff have at times refused to follow procedures for receiving and posting member state national reports that contain references to Taiwan, and they have cited the ostensible requirements of Resolution 2758 and their understanding of legal guidance from within the Secretariat as the basis for their decisions. This happened, for example, with some of Taiwan's diplomatic partners' voluntary national reviews, VNR, on sustainable development submitted to the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA. Some of these reports thanked Taiwan or the Republic of China, Taiwan, rather than Taiwan, province of China for assistance with pursuing sustainable development goals. The UNDESA website for posting member state VNRs previously included a disclaimer that largely followed the position set forth in the memorandum. The documents and reports submitted by states that are available on this website have been placed on the platform as received from those states. The designations employed do not imply the expression of any opinion whatsoever on the part of the Secretariat of the UN concerning the legal status of any country, territory, or area, or of its authorities or concerning its frontiers or boundaries. Around 2018, UNDESA began to refuse to publish on its website VNRs that use terminology other than Taiwan, province of China. The website also dropped the disclaimer. In 2023, a handbook on submitting one type of UNDESA VNR declared that VNR reports need to use official UN country/designations in order to be posted on the UN website. Some member states declined to adopt the Taiwan, province of China terminology or to eliminate references to Taiwan in their VNRs. Their reports were denied the circulation and posting that had been the established practice for VNRs, in some cases on the purported grounds that OLA legal opinions required this outcome. Such UNDESA behavior lacks a basis in publicly disclosed legal guidance from OLA or other known authoritative UN sources and constitutes an impermissible interference with the rights of member states that the 2010 OLA Memorandum warned against. Like other efforts to limit the use of terms other than Taiwan, province of China, the refusal to post UNDESA VNRs triggered a range of reactions from the states that sought to file the reports using language of which Beijing disapproves. Responses have included leaving the reports unchanged and unposted, challenging the receiving agency's action as lacking a legal basis, whether in Resolution 2758, OLA interpretations, or other sources, objecting to UN officials' refusal to post reports submitted by member states, and calls for UNDESA to revert to its earlier practice and thereby at least implicitly drop its recent misinterpretation of Resolution 2758 to preclude the posting of documents referencing Taiwan or the ROC with language other than Taiwan, province of China. Such pushback and discussions with senior UN staff appear to have prompted a reversal. By the 2023-24 cycle, new VNRs containing references to the Republic of China, Taiwan, were again being posted on the UNDESA website, with a disclaimer similar to that recommended in the 2010 OLA Memorandum. The documents and reports submitted by states that are available on this website have been placed on this website as received. The designations employed do not imply the expression of any opinion whatsoever on the part of the Secretariat of the United Nations concerning the legal status of any country, territory, or area, or of its authorities, or concerning its frontiers or boundaries. The Secretariat of the United Nations is guided by the resolutions of the principal organs of the United Nations. Title 4, Calling Taiwan an Integral Part of China/Issues of Representation and Access. Apparent UN support for the PRC's claims concerning the legal implications of Resolution 2758 for Taiwan's status also stems from additional sources, statements by UN entities and officials made in connection with efforts to seek Taiwan's membership or representation at the UN, statements from UN entities and officials about the related issue of Taiwan's accession to UN-based treaties, and UN practices concerning the access of Taiwan/ROC passport holders to UN activities or facilities. In these contexts, UN officials and organs have stated that the organization considers Taiwan to be an integral part or a part of China or the People's Republic of China. This characterization is often preceded by a phrase such as for all purposes or for all intents and purposes, and declared to be required by Resolution 2758 and/or legal guidance from within the UN Secretariat. At a recent press conference, a spokesperson for the Secretary-General answered the question for UN, Taiwan is part of China or not, with a muddled our position on China is guided by the General Assembly resolution passed in 1971 on the One China policy. In another recent example, the General Assembly President, in a meeting with the PRC's permanent representative to the UN, reaffirmed that the body would adhere to the One China principle guided by GA Resolution 2758. Perhaps the highest profile and most controversial example of such UN characterizations of Taiwan came in the context of the effort in 2007 by several of its diplomatic allies to have the UN consider the question of membership for Taiwan. Taiwan pursued this ambitious and unattainable goal during the final years of Chen Shui-bian's presidency, going beyond the then recent pursuit of lesser forms of representation and inclusion. Unsurprisingly, it generated an especially high level of attention, contention, and controversy. In answering a reporter's question about why the UN had refused to consider a proposal for Taiwan's entry, UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon said, "The matter which you asked me was carefully considered by the Secretariat, and, in light of the resolution which I mentioned, 2758, it was not legally possible to receive the purported application for membership." Ban's remarks echoed a more detailed statement by one of his spokespeople. An application for UN membership by Taiwan was conveyed by the permanent representatives of 2 member states. In keeping with Resolution 2758 of the General Assembly, it could not be received and was, thus, returned by the United Nations Office of Legal Affairs. And as you know, Resolution 2758, which was adopted in 1971, is the basis of the One China policy of the United Nations. A similar view was set forth in a letter from the Undersecretary-General for Legal Affairs, the UN Legal Council, approved by the Secretary-General's office, to the UN missions of states that had sought to put the issue of Taiwan's membership on the General Assembly's agenda. The letter concluded that the application may not be received and is thus hereby returned. The point was reiterated in UN legal officials' responses to letters from missions of Taiwan's diplomatic partners criticizing the decision and calling for reconsideration. In explaining the rejection of the 2007 effort, Ban and the Legal Council construed Resolution 2758 as establishing that the UN, as the Legal Council's letters stated, considers Taiwan for all intents and purposes to be an integral part of the People's Republic of China, or that, as Ban said in a press conference, the position of the United Nations is that Taiwan is part of China. The Secretary-General and the OLA took a similar position after an effort by several of Taiwan's diplomatic partners to forward to the General Assembly President Taiwan's instruments of accession to the UN Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. The Secretariat, following the advice of the Legal Council/OLA and working primarily through letters from the Legal Council to the member state missions that forwarded the accession documents, declared that the documents were not receivable and were returned because Resolution 2758, by recognizing the PRC as the only legitimate representative of China to the UN, had determined that the organization considers the Republic of China, Taiwan, for all intents and purposes to be an integral part of the People's Republic of China. Here again, however, there is less to support the PRC's construction of Resolution 2758 than such statements may seem to suggest. The Secretary-General and the UN's legal offices have little authority to make definitive determinations of international law beyond the scope of the UN and its activities. Given the limits to Resolution 2758's wording and the General Assembly's powers, the UN Legal Council's letter adopted something of a legal non sequitur in basing its conclusion on the resolution's recognition of the representatives of the PRC as the only legitimate representatives of China to the UN. The same can be said of the Legal Council's letters and memo concerning the rejection of the instruments for CEDAW accession. These documents drew much the same inference and oddly eschewed a simpler legal basis for the decision. Another letter from the Secretary-General, following the Legal Council's advice and drawing on the ostensible CEDAW precedent, invoked Resolution 2758 to rebuff an effort to submit Republic of China, Taiwan, instruments of accession to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. But that letter characterized Resolution 2758 only as recognizing PRC representatives as the sole legitimate representatives of China to the UN, foregoing any reference to the UN's views on Taiwan as a part of China or the PRC. The Legal Council also advised the Secretariat that it would be permissible and, indeed, advisable to permit circulation of the document from member states with the instruments of ratification, which refer to Taiwan as the Republic of China, attached, albeit with a footnote indicating that the Secretary-General had deemed the ratification instruments not receivable. The issue that was decided in the 2007 membership application controversy was a relatively limited one about internal UN procedures, whether documents that would put Taiwan membership on the agenda would or could be received. The UN adopted a notably circumscribed position. When asked if the return of the application documents meant that Taiwan will never be allowed to have other countries apply on its behalf for UN membership, the Secretary General's spokesperson replied that it would be entirely up to the membership of the United Nations to decide on the future membership of the United Nations. The Secretary General's office does not seem to have seen the conclusion that it was required to reject the 2007 submission as a simple or easy legal call. In internal UN discussions over responding to Taiwan's diplomatic partners' complaints and criticism about, and calls for reconsideration of, the application's rejection, the Secretary General's office demurred after the Legal Counsel's office suggested that the response come from the Secretary General. The Secretary General's office instead directed that the Undersecretary General for Legal Affairs and the Assistant Undersecretary respond, purportedly to keep the matter as non-political as possible. In an apparent after-the-fact effort to build confidence in the decision or find cover for it, OLA compiled and sent to the Secretary General's staff a selective collection of past Secretariat documents concerning issues related to Taiwan's status, essentially a greatest hits of Taiwan minimizing UN actions. The documents contained references to Taiwan as a part or integral part of China for all intents and purposes. The 2007 decision came in the context of Beijing's insistent and relentless pressure for acceptance of its position. The PRC's UN mission reportedly pressed the Secretary General not to accept President Chen's 2007 letter seeking Taiwan's admission to the UN since it did not come from a government. This demand led to the passage in the letter from the Undersecretary General for Legal Affairs to the UN missions of Taiwan's diplomatic partners explaining the refusal to accept the application for Taiwan's membership. The Undersecretary General promptly shared the contents of the letter orally with the PRC's Deputy Permanent Representative, who reportedly expressed satisfaction and gratitude. The PRC's UN mission reportedly made similar arguments for rejecting consideration of Taiwan's application to the UN Security Council President, who supported Beijing's position. At the General Assembly's September 2007 floor discussion about putting the application on the agenda, the PRC's representative invoked Resolution 2758, declared that no sovereign state in the room would allow one of its regions to apply for membership in the Assembly, and urged other members not to support Taiwan's separatist interests and to abide by the Charter of the UN, particularly concerning respect for the sovereignty of states and non-interference in internal affairs. In an illustration of the PRC's comprehensive pressure, its permanent representative to the UN Human Rights Organ in Geneva wrote to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to inform her that there would be extremely serious consequences, including major turbulences that may disrupt peace and stability across the Taiwan Straits and the Asia-Pacific, if efforts akin to the already rejected application for Taiwan's UN membership were to succeed. The letter characterized the UN membership-seeking activities of the Taiwan authorities as strongly and unanimously opposed by all justice-upholding countries and people across the world. While such statements are consistent with Beijing's standard approach to Taiwan's participation and representation in the UN system, the positions taken by the ROC's diplomatic partners and, especially, the United States were unusually strong, particularly after bans and the UN Legal Council's characterization of the UN's views on Taiwan's status. Several of Taiwan's diplomatic partners that sought to put its membership application on the UN's agenda in 2007 sent letters to the Secretary General and the Security Council President that rejected the Undersecretary General/Legal Counsel's argument as fallible because the resolution does not disqualify Taiwan from applying for UN membership. Another letter from Taiwan's diplomatic partners stated that, with the greatest respect to the Undersecretary General/Legal Counsel, the OLA had misadvised the Secretary General and that it was impossible to discern from Resolution 2758 any such interpretation that the United Nations considers Taiwan for all intents and purposes to be an integral part of the People's Republic of China. At least two allies also forwarded to the Secretary General correspondence from Taiwan's President and Foreign Minister that insisted on the principle publicly acknowledged by the Secretary General's spokesperson that only the Security Council and the General Assembly have the authority to discuss and decide on UN membership applications and that the Secretariat does not have discretion to reject outright Taiwan's application. The United States 2007 non-paper, which was issued after the Secretary General's non-receipt of the application for Taiwan membership, took issue with UN documents asserting that UN precedent required that Taiwan be treated as part of the PRC and that the United Nations considers Taiwan for all purposes to be an integral part of the PRC. The non-paper also cautioned that the United States would be obliged to disassociate itself from the position of the UN Secretariat if it insists on describing Taiwan as part of the PRC. Ban and the Secretariat faced additional pressure in a meeting between the Secretary General and U.S. Ambassador to the UN Zalmay Khalilzad, from démarches from the United States and Canada, and from a meeting between Japan's UN mission and the OLA Assistant Secretary General. Ban reportedly acknowledged that he had gone too far in his statements and would no longer use the phrase Taiwan is a part of China. Taiwan's 2007 application for UN membership produced such especially fraught reactions in part because Taiwan sought full membership and presaged the referendum that it would hold the following year on the question of whether to seek to enter the UN under the name Taiwan. What happened at the UN in connection with the 2007 bid was, however, only an exceptional, and exceptionally well-documented, instance of a pattern that began in the early 1990s when Taiwan sought greater access and engagement that fell short of full membership. Those efforts started with initiatives by the Lee Teng-hui administration that invoked models of dual representation akin to the two Germanys or the two Koreas. The initiatives have continued in more recent years, resulting in Taiwan's achieving ad hoc participation in the WHA meeting during President Ma Ying-jeou's tenure and unsuccessful calls during Tsai Ing-wen's presidency by the ROC's allies in the General Assembly for allowing Taiwan's participation in the UN. In these other instances, Taiwan's applications, advocacy by its diplomatic partners, objections from the PRC, and responses from the UN were all generally less intense than in 2007. But they fit with a broader dynamic of pressure from the PRC and acquiescence or questionable interpretations by UN officials of Resolution 2758 and UN precedent that created openings for Beijing to advance its agenda of using the UN as a forum to promote its version of the One China principle as accepted international law and as mandated by Resolution 2758, an especially formal legal statement of UN positions similar to those expressed in the context of Taiwan's 2007 bid for UN membership and accession to UN treaties, is an OLA memorandum from March 2010. After summarizing the text of Resolution 2758, with extensive quotations, and characterizing it as regulating the status of Chinese Taipei/Taiwan in the United Nations, the memorandum states, since the adoption of this resolution and in accordance with the decision which it contains, the United Nations has considered Taiwan for all purposes to be an integral part of the People's Republic of China, without any separate status. Such a reversion to language that the Secretary-General reportedly had promised to forego after the Taiwan membership application controversy does not appear to have produced immediate pushback or public rebukes akin to the 2007 U.S. non-paper and concurrent efforts by Taiwan's diplomatic partners, or the U.S. response to Nauru's 2024 shift in diplomatic ties. The reach of the substantive decision in the OLA memorandum is, again, limited. The operative language, like that in the other OLA memorandum of the same year, addresses only a relatively narrow, if important, operational issue, whether passports or another form of official documentation issued by the authorities in Taiwan/Taipei can be accepted by the Secretariat and used to gain access to an official session of a UN organ, in this case the UN Commission on the Status of Women, under CEDAW. The memorandum's broader language concerning the UN's views on Taiwan's status is, like the kindred language in the other 2010 OLA memorandum, the equivalent of dictum. The memorandum's focus on Taiwan-issued passports undercuts its seeming implications for issues of Taiwan's status and anchors its analysis in a long-running discourse and practice concerning those documents in the UN system. The backstory to the memorandum includes a 2009 OLA note concerning access by Taiwan passport holders to UN premises, which responded to an inquiry from the UN missions of 3 of Taiwan's diplomatic allies asking why Taiwan passport holders had been denied access to the 2009 meeting of the Commission on the Status of Women, the same entity at issue in the memorandum. The OLA note followed the standard summary, including quotations, of Resolution 2758, with a statement that, since the adoption of this resolution and in accordance with the decision that it contains, the United Nations has not regarded Taiwan to be a government or to enjoy any form of governmental status or to exercise any governmental power. The Secretariat strictly abides by this decision, which in effect means that it cannot accept any form of official documentation issued by the authorities in Taiwan. There is no mention of whether the UN considers Taiwan to be a part of China or the PRC and no other language that addresses the issue of Taiwan's international legal status or Beijing's One China principle. The note clearly, and, as a matter of international law, sensibly assumes that the question concerns the ROC status as a government vis-a-vis the UN, not Taiwan's status or sovereignty. Simply put, and consistent with an uncontroversial reading of Resolution 2758, the ROC is not accepted at the UN as the government of a member state and, therefore, its passports need not necessarily, and, in the 2009 OLA notes analysis, should not, receive the automatic acceptance accorded to passports issued by the governments of UN member states. The note also piggybacked on earlier cases of UN deference to the PRC's demands, commenting that persons who are known to be officials of or to represent the authorities in Taiwan or Taipei may not participate in meetings of United Nations bodies, unless it is with the agreement of the PRC, as was the case with respect to the 2008 World Health Assembly. But, as the request that led to the 2009 note pointed out, UN positions and practices concerning access to UN facilities for those using Taiwan/ROC passports have been inconsistent, with holders of such passports sometimes gaining entry or participating without prior PRC approval. On some occasions, member states have included Taiwan/ROC passport holders as experts in their delegations to UN conferences. In some cases, experts from Taiwan have participated without incident, with UN authorities deferring to the credentials issued by a UN member state that is among Taiwan's diplomatic partners. Taiwan/ROC nationals have, however, sometimes faced rejection by credentials committees that acquiesced in the PRC's preferences, or they have been dropped from the delegations to avoid disputes in the credentials committee that likely would lead to a formal determination to exclude the Taiwanese nationals, an outcome that would be more harmful to Taiwan's interests. Title 5, Questions of Recognition at the UN. Resolution 2758 uses words related to recognition in two ways. The first is by recognizing that the representatives of the government of the EPRC are the only lawful representatives of China to the United Nations. The second is by undertaking to recognize the representatives of the PRC's government as the only legitimate representative of China to the UN. Such language is a focal point in Beijing's long-running claims concerning the resolution's implications for Taiwan's legal status. Here, too, the PRC has exerted pressure, and the UN has, at times, acquiesced. As the UN Special Rapporteur on Unilateral Acts of States using the nomenclature for Taiwan required in UN documents put it in 2004, in fact, the ambiguous status of Taiwan province of China tends to excite angry protests from China whenever third states act in a manner which can be construed as recognition, or a step towards it. The 2010 WHO document concerning Taiwan and the International Health Regulations, which contains an explicit reference to the PRC's influence on its contents, construed WHA Resolution 25.1 as imposing an obligation for the Secretariat of refraining from actions which could constitute or be interpreted as recognition of a separate status of Taiwanese authorities and institutions from China. In a similar vein, a prominent PRC scholar, defending official views, asserted, the four paragraphs of Resolution 2758 are an integral whole, with the One China principle at the core. The United Nations only recognizes one China, and Taiwan is a part of China. The PRC's legal claim appears to be an argument, not fully articulated, that Resolution 2758's recognition implies recognition of China as a state that includes Taiwan and that the consequences extend beyond the UN system. It also appears to be entwined with another of Beijing's claims concerning Taiwan's international legal status, one that relies on the large number of states that recognize or, often more accurately, maintain diplomatic relations with the PRC compared to the few that do so with the ROC/Taiwan. But here, too, Resolution 2758 and the UN have not done what Beijing today seems to infer or seeks to assert. The first use of a relevant term, recognizing, in the resolution is conventional preamble-like language for a UNGA resolution and cannot be read as using the term in its international legal sense of an act of recognition of a state or government or as a statement with international legal significance. The second use of a relevant term, to recognize, speaks only to the issue of which government, or representatives of which government, can represent the state of China, and does so only in the context of the UN, not more generally in the international system or as a matter of international law. Resolution 2758 does not, in any broader sense, recognize a state or a government, much less address whether Taiwan is part of the state of China. The UN's clearly stated position is that it has no role in recognizing, or refusing to recognize, a purported state or even a government of a state, much less resolving questions of disputed statehood as a matter of international law. The recognition of a new state or government is an act that only other states and governments may grant or withhold. The United Nations is neither a state nor a government, and therefore does not possess any authority to recognize either a state or a government. As an organization of independent states, it may admit a new state to its membership or accept the credentials of the representatives of a new government. During the UN's early days, a memorandum from the Secretary-General, supported by an opinion from the UN Legal Council, adopted this position in the context of considering an argument that the PRC, as the government in control of the Chinese mainland, was the proper representative of China in the UN, when the ROC would still hold the Chinese seat at the UN for another 2 decades. From the standpoint of legal theory, the linkage of representation in an international organization and recognition of a government is a confusion of two institutions which have superficial similarities but are essentially different. The recognition of a new state, or of a new government of an existing state, is a unilateral act which the recognizing government can grant or withhold. The fact remains that the states have refused to accept any such rule that would give the UN the authority to grant recognition, and the United Nations does not possess any authority to recognize either a new state or a new government of an existing state. On the other hand, membership of a state in the United Nations and representation of a state in the organs is clearly determined by a collective act of the appropriate organs. Exclusion or expulsion from the UN and universal lack of recognition as a state by other states in the UN would not establish that an entity, such as Taiwan, is not a state or is part of another state, such as China, under international law. Non-membership or non-representation in the UN does not, as a matter of international law, establish that an entity is not a state. While it is generally accepted, and reflected in the UN Charter, that statehood is a prerequisite to UN membership, non-membership does not mean a lack of statehood. Undisputed states have been long-term non-members, and acquiring membership requires going through a process of votes in the Security Council and the General Assembly, wherein member states are, in practice, free to deny membership to an entity that is a state. Whether an entity is a state under international law depends on whether it does, or does not, possess, as an objective matter, the requisite attributes of statehood, not on whether other states do, or do not, recognize it as a state. Those attributes are possession of a permanent population, a defined territory, an autonomously operating government, and the capacity to engage in relations with other states. These are attributes that Taiwan at least arguably possesses more clearly than do some entities that enjoy, or have enjoyed, widespread international acceptance as states and robust participation or membership in the UN system. Even a successful claim by Beijing that Taiwan is not a separate state under international law would stop short of establishing that Taiwan is a part of China or the PRC or that Beijing's One China principle is part of international law. Title 6, Resolution 2758 Beyond the UN and Customary International Law. Beijing seeks to extend the reach and implications of its reading of Resolution 2758 beyond the UN context into other international forums and into the realm of customary international law. In one illustrative example of efforts to extend Resolution 2758's reach, the PRC objected when two designated UN human rights experts in their official capacity went to Taiwan and participated in its internal process for assessing its conformity with the two principal UN human rights covenants. This process approximated parts of the Universal Periodic Review undertaken by parties to the two covenants and was unilaterally undertaken by Taiwan despite being denied accession. The letter from the PRC's permanent representative in Geneva complained that the two experts' presence in Taiwan was a violation of the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and UN General Assembly Resolution 2758, as well as China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Chinese official sources suggest that Resolution 2758 provides a basis for excluding Taiwan from international organizations, including those beyond the UN system. For example, in the context of Beijing's withdrawal of what it characterized as its permission for Taiwan representatives to participate in the 2017 WHA annual meeting, the PRC's permanent mission in Geneva requested all international organizations, a term that appears to extend to non-UN affiliated bodies, in the city to continue their adherence to the One China principle by foregoing the sideline meetings that representatives from Taiwan, now barred from the WHA, likely would seek. The same document described the One China principle as having a legal basis in Resolution 2758 and WHA Resolution 25.1. Beijing's agenda has scored some recent notable successes with a multi-state organization and a state that dropped diplomatic relations with Taipei and established them with Beijing. Parlacen, the Central American Parliament, voted in 2023 to strip Taiwan of its observer status, citing Resolution 2758 and its implication that Taiwan was a province of China and not an independent country. In the aftermath of Democratic Progressive Party candidate Lai Ching-te's win in Taiwan's 2024 presidential election, Nauru shifted its diplomatic ties from Taipei to Beijing and stated, "We will be moving to the One China principle that is in line with UN Resolution 2758. The United States pushed back, with the American Institute in Taiwan chair, then in Taipei, saying that the resolution did not make a determination on the status of Taiwan and that it was disappointing to see distorted narratives about UN Resolution 2758 being used as a tool to pressure Taiwan, limit its voice on the international stage, and influence its diplomatic relationships. Beijing also invokes Resolution 2758 in the service of another, more sweeping and, for Taiwan, potentially more threatening argument, namely that Taiwan's status as a part of China, or the PRC's One China principle, is an established proposition of international law, binding on all states. This claim rests in part on a misconstruction of the legal significance of tallies of diplomatic ties, and patterns of international relations more broadly, with the PRC and the ROC. Beijing has sought to frame its One China principle as a universal consensus or broad-based consensus of the international community and as a basic norm of international relations. Such statements sometimes invoke the fact that the vast majority of countries, now 182, maintain diplomatic relations with the PRC while only 12 have such links with Taiwan. Such statements also claim that relations with the PRC have been established on the basis of the One China principle. Such statements are sometimes adjacent to invocations of Resolution 2758 as a purported source of international law, as in the 2022 White Paper's claim that actions Beijing views as challenging its sovereignty over Taiwan and its One China principle, such as professing that the status of Taiwan is undetermined or supporting bids for Taiwan's meaningful participation in the UN system, are violations of Resolution 2758 and international law. Although generally not explicitly so framed, such assertions appear to be, or reflect, claims about customary international law, which generally binds all states. A formulation by a PRC international legal scholar offers a hedged version of this line of argument. After Resolution 2758 came out, the vast majority of UN member states adopted a position consistent with it by recognizing the One China principle. It is already considered by the academia as meeting the criteria for the formation of an international customary law, and showing the tendency toward developing into a customary international law. Resolution 2758 is a political document encapsulating the One China principle whose legal authority leaves no room for doubt and has been recognized worldwide. But this apparent argument also falls short. Beijing's One China principle is an exceedingly poor candidate for a rule of customary international law. Such rules are almost always of some generality. They include, for example, rules defining statehood, sovereign immunity, the validity of treaties, or self-determination rights of peoples. Determinations that a particular entity is, or is not, a state, or that a particular area is the sovereign territory of one state or another, or that the use of force to prevent secession and a rebellion, or civil war is or is not legitimate in a particular instance are generally case-specific applications of rules of international law, including customary international law. They are not rules of international law in their own right. If not submitted to a binding international dispute resolution procedure, the application of customary international legal rules to address particular cases is, at best, a decentralized process left to the community of states and other international actors that often produces no definitive answer on contentious questions. A rule of customary international law must reflect the general and consistent, though not necessarily universal, practice of states, and states must act in conformity with that practice with a sense that such behavior is a legal obligation, opinion juris, rather than a mere policy choice. Statements and actions at the UN by member states concerning Taiwan could constitute expressions of state views, the phenomena that matter for opinion juris, as well as a weak form of state practice. But even if they do not reach the level of states' general acceptance that they are obliged, as a matter of international law, to accept that Taiwan is a part of China or Beijing's One China principle. The stances and statements of states' representatives at the UN are at most the thinnest form of state practice, if they count as state practice at all. To accept such behavior as potentially establishing a proposition of customary international law would be to venture into the murky waters of purported instant custom and to assert that such statements, unsupported by substantial patterns of state behavior, are a mode of creating international law. Moreover, as the debates over Taiwan's UN admission bids, the 2007 U.S. non-paper, Taiwan's diplomatic allies' extensive pushback against the Secretariat's interpretations of Resolution 2758, and much else in the many iterations of proposals for Taiwan's representation or participation in the UN system indicate, the practice and opinions of states is far from uniform, even in the UN context. On many occasions in the UN, the United States and Taiwan's diplomatic partners have rejected the PRC's and UN officials' assertions concerning Resolution 2758 and the One China principle. The basis for most member states' deference to the Secretary-General or the UN General Committee or, on rare occasions, their votes against Taiwan-related initiatives are vague or varied and far from expressing a prevalent or uniform view in support of Beijing's One China principle as a part of international law. The fact that the vast majority of states maintain diplomatic relations with the PRC and not with the ROC, a point much emphasized by Beijing, does little to support its claim that its One China principle is international law. To be sure, when one government recognizes another or establishes diplomatic relations, the action implies a view that the counterpart is a government of a state. Otherwise, such recognition or relations would be unlawful. But the absence of diplomatic relations, like the absence of recognition, does not imply a view that the entity denied such relations is not a government of a state. International law permits, and governments often undertake, severance of diplomatic relations for political or foreign policy reasons, and such acts alone do not challenge the targeted entity's status as a government, much less its status as a state. Beijing claims that countries that have established diplomatic relations with the PRC have done so on the basis of the One China principle, meaning Beijing's One China principle. If this were true, those states would thereby arguably have expressed views on Taiwan's international legal status. But the assertion is unfounded. The foundations of the United States' establishment of diplomatic relations with the PRC, as well as its recognition of the PRC as the government of China, include Washington's One China policy, which U.S. sources consistently define as different from Beijing's One China principle. The 1979 U.S.-PRC Joint Communique declares that the United States acknowledges, not recognized or accepts, the PRC's view that Taiwan is part of China. Several other states have adopted similar views. Many more have taken a variety of positions that do not adopt Beijing's One China principle. Although those features of Taiwan's international situation limit its ability to participate in the global community, here, too, there is less than may initially appear. Formal diplomatic ties are only one mode of engaging in international relations. Taiwan maintains with many states informal relations that are more robust in practice than those conducted by many states. If those relationships and roles are considered, as they should be under international law, Taiwan has strong claims to meet all criteria for statehood. The paucity of formal diplomatic relations and the absence of recognition of Taiwan as a state do not establish that it lacks state status. Beijing's claims about Resolution 2758's significance for Taiwan's international legal status at times rely on an understanding that was shared by the PRC and the ROC when the resolution was adopted, that Taiwan was part of the state of China. This argument is, in effect, an expansive and highly problematic version of a claim of estoppel, that the ROC government's position in 1971 has locked that view in place and precluded Taiwan from later adopting a different position that would have any legal significance within or beyond the UN. Taiwan's position, of course, has changed, with Taiwan's presidents from Lee Teng-hui onward, and their governments declaring, in a variety of formulations, that Taiwan and/or the ROC is an independent and sovereign country, and sometimes seeking representation or membership in the UN, where membership is generally understood to be limited to sovereign states. To assert that Resolution 2758 so entrenched the One China notion, at the time shared by the PRC and the ROC, as enduringly binding international law would be an extraordinarily sweeping claim. Even if the PRC claims that Taiwan and all states were initially bound by the ROC's earlier agreement with a version of a One China principle were correct, international law permits profound changes of fact to alter legal obligations. This flexibility exists even when a party has agreed, for example, in a binding treaty, to a legal obligation, which the ROC did not do in the context of Resolution 2758, which was adopted after the ROC's representatives left the General Assembly. Among the bases international law recognizes for changing rules or obligations without the consent of a state that benefits from them are several that resonate with the case of contemporary Taiwan: fundamental changes in circumstances as a basis for ending valid treaty obligations, the erosion, reform, or replacement of customary international legal rules through changes, often gradual, in state practice and opinion juris, and cases in which states have come into being without the consent of states from which they have broken away, including in some cases where separation has occurred through means of contested or questionable international legality. Title 7: International Legal Logic and Political Consequences of Beijing's Strategy. The PRC's focus on Resolution 2758 and related statements and actions of UN organs and officials have offered Beijing several advantages in promoting its claim that its One China principle is international law. The UN is a singularly universal and high-impact institution in the international legal order. Resolution 2758 is a long-standing, especially high-profile, and formal law-adjacent international action that has some apparent connection, even if a weak, oblique, and often exaggerated one, to questions of Taiwan's international legal status. The resolution also predates the period when Taiwan's government began to articulate positions that challenged or qualified the idea of a single China that includes Taiwan. In the years since the resolution's adoption, the UN has provided a congenial forum for the PRC to press its case for its One China principle. The UN's one-state, one-vote structure has played to Beijing's advantage. The PRC has been able to use carrots, sticks, ideological solidarity with the Global South, and Taiwan's exclusion from the UN arena to garner support or at least acquiescence from a majority of states on an issue that is of low salience to them but of great importance to Beijing. As developments discussed in this report illustrate, Beijing has had considerable ability to pressure or persuade UN officials and has been relentless in doing so. Although UN officials are required not to favor the interests of their home countries, and UN officials are obliged not to take instructions from member states, PRC nationals in the UN and its specialized agencies, and other international organizations, are numerous, often high-ranking, and have drawn criticism or concern that they promote their country's preferred outcomes. PRC nationals have headed relevant UN entities when Beijing has recorded some of its big gains in pressing, or laying the foundations, for its claims concerning Resolution 2758 and the legal status of its One China principle. Examples include the WHO under a Director General from Hong Kong from 2006 to 2017 and UNDESA under a PRC Undersecretary General for Economic and Social Affairs since 2007. While Beijing has pushed hard at the UN, it seems often to have been pushing against a relatively open door, sometimes eliciting preemptive compliance with its agenda. Many of the examples addressed in this report show UN organs and official statements going farther than Resolution 2758 or authoritative legal guidance required, often increasingly so over time. This pattern may reflect the existence or anticipation of pressure or complaints from Beijing, as some internal UN documents suggest, coupled with less robust counter-pressure and attention from those holding contrary views, including from Taiwan itself, which has been largely banned from direct engagement with UN staff. Or it may show Taiwan's low salience for the leadership and staff of a vast set of international organizations that has almost entirely excluded Taiwan throughout their professional lifetimes. Or it may be a consequence of the influence of PRC nationals holding relevant positions in the UN system. Or it may indicate a cumulative, accidental drift from circumspect formal legal interpretations and guidance to more sweeping, rigid, and unnuanced statements and actions that became more closely aligned with Beijing's views, especially from UN staff who are not legally trained and who operate downstream from the Secretary General's office and the legal interpretations it adopts. Or the over-reading of Resolution 2758 may be a product of ambiguity, diffusion, and asymmetry of authority and responsibility in the UN system for legal advice. Secretaries General and their spokespeople have said that their problematic positions are guided by advice from the OLA and the UN Legal Council, whether because they believe themselves bound by it or because it provided a convenient means for deflecting responsibility. Or it may reflect OLA's interpretation of the Secretary General's or the Secretariat's preferences. The view from OLA, typical of legal advisors' offices in large governmental institutions and often reflected in the tone of internal communications concerning Taiwan and Resolution 2758, is that its role is partly to provide legal justifications for the Secretariat's policy choices, and that it must be mindful of the Secretary General's discretion not to seek, to interpret narrowly, or even to disregard its legal advice. Or it may be the manifestation of clear, if legally questionable and not openly disclosed, directives from higher-level authorities in the Secretariat to staff in the UN's functional bodies. Or it may reflect some combination of these factors and others. Whatever the mechanism, the arc from what Resolution 2758 says, did, and could do to UN statements and actions that the PRC can count as wins is a product of dynamics in the UN system that have been favorable to the PRC's agenda and have produced outcomes that greatly exceed what can be grounded in authoritative UN statements and actions. The PRC's gains within the UN system on seemingly abstruse issues of nomenclature, characterizations of Taiwan's status, recognition, and other matters linked to Resolution 2758 are of such interest to the PRC, Taiwan, and the international community because they could have significant broader international legal and, in turn, political implications. If Beijing wins acceptance of its proposition that Taiwan is a part of China or the PRC or its One China principle is a settled issue in international law, it will be in a much strengthened position to assert that its use or threat of force to achieve unification would be lawful, and that many measures by the United States and others seeking to prevent or deter coerced unification, including intervening in a conflict or providing military assistance to Taiwan, would be unlawful. While international law will not have the last word on such weighty issues, being on the right or wrong side of the law matters in international politics. It can strengthen or weaken deterrence and affect the likelihood of collective action by the international community to respond to Beijing's pressure, threats, or action. The PRC has made no secret of its thinking here. The 2022 White Paper, for example, invokes the important principles of respecting state sovereignty and territorial integrity as enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations and in modern international law and the basic norms of international relations. The White Paper adds that it is the sacred right of every sovereign state to safeguard territorial integrity. It goes without saying that the Chinese government is entitled to take all measures necessary to settle the Taiwan question and achieve national reunification, free of external interference. The White Paper also characterizes various U.S. actions that suggest Taiwan's status as unresolved or that seek to bolster Taiwan's international stature and, in turn, alter Taiwan's status as part of China as violations of Resolution 2758 and international law that damage China's sovereignty and treat the basic principles of international law with contempt. The PRC's letters to the Secretary General opposing consideration of proposals for Taiwan's membership, representation, or other participation in the UN system, including in the WHA, included similar criticisms. Playing up the Taiwan question at the United Nations is in essence an attempt to undermine China's state sovereignty. Safeguarding national sovereignty and territorial integrity is a core tenet of the Charter of the United Nations and of the basic norms of international relations, which Taiwan's bid for inclusion in the UN challenges, and raising this so-called issue of the representation of the Republic of China, Taiwan, in the United Nations has encroached upon China's sovereignty and territorial integrity and grossly interfered in China's internal affairs. Such language, and similar statements found in many other official PRC statements, invoke the core international legal obligations that are set forth in key provisions of the UN Charter, including Article 2, 4, which requires all members to refrain from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, and Article 2, 7, which stipulates non-interference, although explicitly only by the UN, in matters that are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. These provisions are generally accepted as binding on all states as principles of customary international law or, at least in the case of Article 2, 4, as peremptory norms of international law from which no derogation is permitted. If Beijing's One China principle and the idea that the Taiwan question is a domestic or internal issue are accepted, the international legal consequences are profound. Beijing's threat or use of force or other coercive measures against Taiwan to achieve unification would not run afoul of the core prescriptions set forth in Article 2, 4, Article 2, 7, or even the correlative obligation to resolve international disputes peacefully is set forth in Article 2, 3. Taiwan would definitively lack the rights that a sovereign state enjoys in international law to be free from the use or threat of force against its territorial integrity or political independence, or to seek assistance from the United States or others in exercising an inherent right to individual or collective self-defense against an armed attack, recognized in Article 51 of the UN Charter and accepted as customary international law. Taiwan would also lack the right that states have to receive arms and other military assistance from other states. The United States and other states would be broadly prohibited, with limited exceptions, from military intervention and some other forms of crucial assistance to Taiwan. Such actions, at least arguably, would be the equivalent of unlawful interventions to support a revolution, rebels in a civil war, or a secessionist movement inside a sovereign state. But even if the PRC's preferred position were a settled matter of international law, it would not mean as much as Beijing appears to assume or assert. It would not make PRC actions toward Taiwan, especially moves to achieve unification by force, free from international legal constraints and immune to lawful responses by other states. Many PRC measures against Taiwan could contravene the broad obligation not to threaten or use force in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations, which is set forth in Article 2, 4, of the UN Charter and is, therefore, a treaty obligation for the PRC and also arguably binding as customary international law. Even internal conflicts can be matters of international legal concern, including threats to international peace and security for which collective responses by states, potentially including the use of force, are lawful responses. The principal legal mechanism for addressing such threats is the UN Security Council. The PRC would surely veto any unfavorable resolutions in that body but, as the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine demonstrates, a deadlocked or stymied Security Council does not end the effort, or ability, to hold an aggressor to account through, in part, invoking legal norms and principles in UN debates and in the international community more broadly. In cases where the PRC's use of force and other coercive measures against Taiwan would violate the PRC's international legal obligations, robust responses by the United States and other states would be lawful. Beijing's actions might well violate international humanitarian law and international human rights law, potentially through harm inflicted on people in Taiwan, the international law of the sea, concerning freedom of navigation and maritime commerce, and other international legal rules as well. If Beijing were to use force, threats of force, or other highly coercive means to attempt unification, and invoke claims that its One China principle is international law as a justification, the effort could backfire. A shared sense that Beijing was acting unlawfully and attempting to distort international law might facilitate other states' collective action to impose severe sanctions and perhaps use force, which might well be, under the circumstances, lawful. A cornered Taiwan might declare full and formal independent statehood, whether framed as a belated formal legal assertion of a long-existing state of affairs or as an exercise of the right of the people of Taiwan to self-determination. Taiwan would then likely assert an international legal right to seek military assistance and intervention from the United States and others as part of its right to self-defense, territorial integrity, and political independence. Such a move, of course, would create a more direct challenge to Beijing's One China principle and would exacerbate the crisis by putting the United States and others in the fraught, and hitherto avoided, position of choosing how to respond to that scenario. The dangers posed by acquiescence in the PRC's claims concerning Resolution 2758 extend beyond these dire scenarios. Acceptance of China's position that the resolution establishes the PRC's One China principle as international law would mean significantly greater marginalization of Taiwan in the UN system and beyond, thereby denying the international community full access to Taiwan's potential contributions to addressing global problems of public health, the environment, and more. It also would undermine the UN's integrity. It would set a precedent for distorting the meaning and legal significance of major UN decisions and undermine UN principles of promoting the development of international law and universal representation. And it would be a powerful template and a significant step forward for the PRC's agenda in shaping international law, often in ways that undermine the liberal, rules-based international order that the United States and like-minded countries have long supported.